The Roman legions, they would march across the Mediterranean world, making new conquests for the glory and profit of Rome. How did a culture that so stressed discipline and seriousness of purpose become a synonym for conspicuous consumption and public display? The rise of Rome, this time on the Western tradition. At the beginning of the 5th century BC, when the Greeks were busy throwing back the Persians, a small, barely civilized city-state to the west of Greece was fighting for its life. It sat on a peninsula that was dominated by Gaulish tribes in the north, Etruscan warriors in the center, Greek cities to the south. But within 200 years, this insignificant city called Rome grew up to become master of all Italy and was on the verge of conquering the entire Mediterranean world. It would prove so successful that its myth would endure for 2,000 years, even into our own century. In 800 AD, Charlemagne had himself crowned Roman emperor centuries after Rome's empire had collapsed. In 1804, Napoleon had himself crowned in the same tradition, and he called his heir the King of Rome. Even the Russian Tsars, like Peter here, claimed to rule from the Third Rome, better known as Moscow. And in this century, in Rome itself, the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini would name his system of government fascism after the emblem of authority of ancient Roman magistrates. This extraordinary myth began, as most myths do, in a rather modest way. Rome, like so many other ancient centers, was blessed by geography. The city lay on a fertile plain that could support a relatively dense population with its grain, vegetables, and fruit. Rome also had the advantage of straddling the Tiber River just 15 miles from the sea, where boats could still come upriver. At this point there was first a ford, then a bridge, and across it ran the main north-south road and all the trade that came with it. The bridge was so important to the Romans that it was considered sacred, and the official charged with its upkeep was sacred as well. He was called the Pontifex, and his title lives on in the title of the Roman Catholic Pope, the Pontiff. So Rome began as a market town and a farming community. This is a sign from a greengrocer's shop whose owner likely shared his neighbor's tough-minded, practical, conservative outlook. The virtues the Romans admired were all related to discipline and self-discipline. They believed in pietas, respect for established authority and tradition. They believed in fides, being true to your responsibilities. In religio, the common beliefs that bind men together, and above all, in gravitas, the sober seriousness that marks a real man. Even the word virtue means manliness. Early Roman society was also strictly patriarchal. A Middle Eastern Greek, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, explained it. The lawgiver of the Romans gave virtually full power to the father over his son, even during his whole life, whether he thought proper to imprison him, to scourge him, to put him in chains and keep him at work in the fields, or put him to death. and this even though the son already engaged in public affairs, though he were numbered among the highest magistrates, though he were celebrated for his zeal for the Commonwealth. As for women, they didn't think much of them or about them. A Roman in the 1st century BC wrote to his wife, "If, good luck to you, you bear offspring, if it is male, let it live. If it is female, expose it," which of course meant leaving it to die. One gets the clear impression that there wasn't much kidding around with ancient Romans, as you can see for yourself. They disliked disorder and luxury, which meant excess. The legend of how Rome was founded is a case in point. These are Romulus and Remus, twin brothers who were raised by a she-wolf. Remus refused to follow Romulus's strict orders to behave while the sacred boundaries of Rome were being traced. He jumped over them as if they didn't matter, and Romulus killed him. The moral of this story is that serious things should not be taken lightly. True virtue subordinates the person to the city, the individual to the state. On this solid base of gravitas, or true gravity, the Roman Republic was founded in the 6th century BC. The Romans were a conservative people, and so they wanted strong leaders, but not too strong. So the city's wealthy aristocrats, the patricians, who pretty much monopolized state office, elected two of their kind to the executive office of consul, but only for 1 year. These consuls had vast powers, but they were constrained by law and custom and by the power of the Senate, the main legislative branch. Since the consuls left office to sit as senators for the rest of their lives, it was a foolish consul who totally ignored or defied the will of the Senate. The Roman army also mirrored the values of this hard-bitten society. Every soldier provided his own equipment, which meant that he had to have a farm or some kind of property so he could have the necessary resources to buy a shield and helmet, a sword, a spear, and a pack on his back. If you didn't have all this, you didn't get into the army. So the landless poor did not fight. They were called the proletariat because their only contribution to the state was their proles, or offspring. They didn't pay taxes, and they had no say in how the city was run. Commoners in general were known as plebeians, and they could be small farmers, artisans, servants of the patrician landowners. For 2 centuries, the more prosperous among them would struggle for political and social rights with mixed success. But it was their army service that gave them their greatest bargaining power. The primary attraction of life in the army was a very important fringe benefit, the spoils of war. And the potential for these spoils was going to increase dramatically after a war in the 4th century BC with the Samnites, a people who lived in the mountains to the southeast of Rome. At the beginning of the war with the Samnites, the Roman army fought like this in the phalanx, a tight formation without much room to maneuver. But then they switched to smaller self-contained units of 120 men called maniples. 3 maniples made a cohort of 360 men, and 10 cohorts made a legion. These smaller units could operate in a checkerboard pattern that allowed for a lot of flexibility. But they also made greater demands on the individual soldier, and they could be perfected only by strict training and discipline. So these Roman infantry were invariably better trained than their opponents. The legions proved so superior in discipline and determination to the cruder troops of Rome's neighbors that by the middle of the 3rd century BC, the city on the Tiber controlled nearly all of the peninsula. It was then that the Romans did something that turned their military advantage into an even greater political advantage. Instead of slaughtering or enslaving their defeated enemies as was the fashion, the Romans made them allies. They took some of their land to settle Romans, and they didn't treat them all alike because the Senate's maxim was divide and rule. But on the whole, each conquered Italian state was allowed to run its own affairs. All that Rome asked was control of the state's foreign policy and military aid in time of war. It was an extremely liberal arrangement for those days, and it was eventually followed by the extension of Roman citizenship throughout the rest of Italy. So Rome gained the attachment of neighboring states in a way that no Greek city ever managed. These attachments were then cemented by building first-class roads which provided concrete bonds, quite literally, where ideological bonds might not have sufficed. Examples of Roman skill in civil engineering are everywhere you look in Italy today. This is an ancient sewer. And these are the ruins of a Roman aqueduct. They serve to remind us that technology can have long-lasting political uses as well as practical ones. By 270 BC or so, their last enemies on the peninsula, the Greek cities in the south, had been brought to heel. But once Rome controlled this territory, she was going to be drawn into the wider Mediterranean sphere and would collide with the Carthaginians, the Greeks' chief business rivals and enemies. This is an artist's conception of Carthage as it might have been in the 3rd century BC when it went to war with Rome. What had begun more than 500 years earlier as a Phoenician colony in North Africa had become the greatest naval power in the Western Mediterranean. In Rome, the Senate was under increasing pressure to protect the southern cities from Carthage after the Carthaginians got mixed up in a local war in Sicily, thus upsetting the balance of power. The Senate was reluctant, but then it gave in to popular demand in 264 BC, and the first of 3 Punic Wars began, Punic meaning Phoenician. The wars with Carthage would do 2 very important things to Rome. First, in order to beat a naval power, Rome had to become one, which it did. These are Roman shipbuilders helping Rome rule the waves, as every Mediterranean empire must, whether it's Athens 2 centuries before or Turkey 1700 years later. Like all sailors in the ancient Mediterranean, the Romans used galleys propelled by rowers. Galleys were invented by the Egyptians, who could sail down the Nile but needed to row back upriver. By the time the First Punic War was over 24 years later, Rome had made Sicily a province and was soon to add Corsica and Sardinia and move into Spain, a Carthaginian stronghold. Which brings us to the second result of the Punic Wars. All this territory was won by Rome's fleet, which was built to win a single war, but which ended by gaining an empire. The Romans had never meant to be drawn so far away from home, but the fleet ensured that they would be. After Rome defeated Carthage, she went on to defeat the Macedonians, the Greeks, the Asian heirs of Alexander the Great, and finally Egypt as well. But there were some close calls. The Second Punic War began in 218 BC when Hannibal, a Carthaginian general, set out from Spain to invade Italy. Since the Romans now controlled the sea, Hannibal had to go overland through 1,000 miles of hostile territory. When he made it across the first obstacle, the Pyrenees, he had about 40,000 soldiers and 37 African elephants which were meant to strike terror in the hearts of Rome. By the time he crossed the Alps, however, he had less than half his troops and almost no elephants. Nevertheless, Hannibal was so brilliant a general that he beat the Romans to a pulp. He outwitted them, outfought them, and by 216 BC he was camping under the walls of Rome itself. If Hannibal had succeeded as well in his political strategy as he had in his military strategy, the history of Western civilization might have been quite different. But when he called on the other Italian cities to join him against Rome, they turned a deaf ear. Rome's liberal policy towards them had paid off. While Hannibal hung around looking for support, the Roman fleet cut off his supplies and then landed troops first in Spain, then in North Africa near Carthage itself. Hannibal was forced to return home to defend his territory, and Rome was saved. When Carthage foolishly went to war one more time 2 generations later, the angry Romans obliterated the city, literally tearing it down. The Punic Empire was no more. By this time, Rome itself had profoundly changed in all sorts of ways. For one thing, the old Roman infantry, which had been formed by annual levies, was replaced by professional infantry, which signed up for long tours of duty and was paid by the state or by generals from the booty they captured. So you could use the troops for long campaigns, which were more attractive now because they could pay for themselves and even return a profit. What had begun as a quest to defend Roman borders against Carthage and against other hostile states eventually became a brutal search for territory and riches. This is how Plutarch describes a Roman victory celebration or triumph. The triumph lasted for 3 days. On the first, which was scarcely long enough for the sight, would be seen the statues, pictures, colossal images taken from the enemy, drawn upon 250 chariots. On the second day was carried in a great many wagons the finest and richest armor of the Macedonians, both of brass and steel. On the third day first came the trumpeters, who did not sound as they were wont in a procession or solemn entry, but such a charge as the Romans use when they encourage the soldiers to fight. Followed by young men wearing frocks with ornamented borders, who led to the sacrifice 120 stalled oxen. The more enemies to defeat, of course, the more jobs for soldiers and for the patricians and their hangers-on as well, who would be sent out to govern and tax and squeeze the provinces. This became the basis of Roman foreign policy, a very different spirit from the sensible federal approach they had followed in Italy itself. The spreading empire had other effects. It brought Rome into close contact with more sophisticated cultures. It suggested new tastes, new fashions, new luxuries unknown to the sober, frugal, older generations. The loot of a dozen regions was now flowing into Rome, and young gentlemen were learning to admire beautiful things and to collect them and to talk about them, while old gentlemen deplored the decadence this represented. Display and conspicuous consumption and luxus at its worst. There were lots of Romans making money in the 2nd and the 1st century BC, and quite naturally they wanted to show off their wealth. This is also when expensive homes began to include a vomitorium, a room where you could go and vomit what you had just eaten, so you could go back out and eat and drink another meal. It's hard to imagine a better example of conspicuous consumption. This is what the Tribune Sallust had to say about the morals of his time. As soon as wealth came to be a mark of distinction and an easy way to renown to military commands, to political power, virtue began to decline. Poverty was now looked on as a disgrace, and a blameless life as a sign of ill nature. Riches made the younger generation a prey to luxury, avarice, pride. Squandering with one hand what they grabbed with the other, they set small value on their own property while they coveted that of others. Honor and modesty, all laws, human and divine, were alike disregarded in a spirit of recklessness and intemperance. Conspicuous consumption and large-scale display also became a part of politics. In 65 BC, Julius Caesar paid for 400 lions and 320 pairs of gladiators to fight and murder each other in one single show, all to amuse the public and gain political support. And along this main road, the famous Appian Way, you could see 6,000 crosses, each with its own crucified rebel slave. This new interest in public display also affected art. Honorific statues, portraits, historical paintings, political advertising of all kinds were everywhere. Beauty now fulfilled a public function and was heavily involved in propaganda and publicity. This concern for impressing people explains why architecture becomes the Roman art par excellence. The idea of empire would be manifested in great, solemn, spectacular buildings like these. Temples, palaces, triumphal arches and columns, reflecting the grandeur of Rome and sometimes delusions of grandeur. Colossal pride made for colossal proportions, as the Colosseum, Rome's huge stadium, attests. The greater the proportions, the greater the power of Rome. The richer the decorations, the richer the Roman people seem destined to become. So even if you were a poor Roman, you could still participate vicariously in this orgy of conspicuous consumption and self-congratulation. But was it enough? For a while, yes, but eventually the strain of gaining and then holding on to such a huge amount of territory was going to take its toll on the Republic, especially on its poorer citizens. We shall see how in our next program, which is about the Roman Empire. In the 1st century BC, the Roman Republic was plunged into civil war. Powerful generals and their private armies fought for control of the state until one man stood victorious, the absolute master of the Mediterranean world. The Roman Empire, this time on the Western tradition. When we left Rome at the end of the 2nd century BC, it was triumphant in its growing wealth and power. But if you were an ordinary Roman, there was also a great deal to be worried about. The wars of expansion into Greece and Asia had dealt a terrible blow to small freehold farmers who were the mainstay of the Roman state. Those who went off to war returned to find their farms gone to pot, and they were the lucky ones. A lot of men never returned at all. Once back home, the survivors had trouble re-establishing their holdings. Cheap grain was now pouring in from the provinces, the same provinces, ironically, that the farmer soldiers had helped to conquer. With so much grain now available on the market, prices plummeted. Much of the farmer's land was better suited to other uses anyway, raising cattle or growing grapes or olives. And all of these could be worked cheaper on much larger spreads by slaves provided in great numbers and who furnished hard labor in return for bare subsistence. The family farmer could not compete. The rich, who found the capital to buy up the small farms, got richer, while the farmers got poorer, and a lot of them sold out to large landowners. They moved into the city to swell the number of proletarians, to live on the bounty of the state, and to be manipulated by the politicians. Cicero, the statesman and philosopher, was advised by his brother to flatter endlessly. This is wrong and shameful in ordinary life, but necessary in running for office. Let the voters say and think that you know them well, that you greet them by name, that you are generous and open-handed. If possible, accuse your competitors of having a bad reputation for crime, vice, or bribery. And so, by the late 2nd century BC, social unrest had become a serious problem. The displaced and needy masses were pressured by the rich, trying to squeeze as much as possible out of them, and this included the conservative Senate, which was indifferent to their plight. The poor of Rome had few political options. Constitutionally, authority lay in the Senate and the people, but practically the state was run by the Senate alone. And this august body, with its massive authority and responsibilities, was really a municipal council that had been propelled into governing half the known world. It was simply not equipped for the job. Most senators just wanted the world to stand still, but it wouldn't stand still, it never does. While the senators could handle foreign problems by simply throwing soldiers at them, social and economic problems were beyond them. In 133 BC, Tiberius Gracchus, the noble grandson of the man who defeated Hannibal, took up the cause of the poor. he tried to limit the size of large estates and to provide land for the landless. But he was murdered by a group of conservative senators and their followers, beaten to death with chairs. His brother, Caius Gracchus, tried to carry on his work, but he too was murdered. It appeared that the Senate, with its determination to keep the status quo, had triumphed. But in fact, the political landscape had been changed by the Gracchi brothers and their followers. For the first time in Roman history, a popular party had grown up to challenge the authority of the Senate. But this was not a blow for democracy, as some might expect. On the contrary, the situation was made to order for men like Julius Caesar, who knew how to use and manipulate class hatred and social unrest for their own careers. Caesar was one of several outstanding generals who were also politicians, men who married politics to the army in the 1st century before Christ. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar, they would all become dictators in turn, either in the name of the people or of the Senate and so-called tradition. It didn't seem to matter which. The 1st century BC was a bloody time of plots and rivalries among men who were too powerful to be stopped themselves, yet not quite powerful enough to stop others from following in their footsteps. With their armies behind them, they would march into Rome in times of crisis and force the Senate to vote them extraordinary powers, ostensibly to bring order and stability to the state. Then they would eliminate their enemies as best they could, opening an era of political murder that was going to last for several centuries and that would fill the history books with the most fascinating gore. The generals also became very rich men. Here is Plutarch's description of Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a very successful commander who retired to private life in 63 before Christ. Lucullus's life presents us at the beginning with political acts and military commands, and at the end with drinking bouts and banquets and what were practically orgies, torch races, all manner of frivolity. For I count as frivolity his sumptuous buildings, porticos and baths, still more his paintings and statues. You see, he doesn't like the absence of gravitas. Once, when he dined alone, he became angry because only one modest course had been prepared, and called the slave in charge. When the slave said that he didn't think there would be need of anything expensive, since there were no guests, Lucullus said, "What? Do you not know that today Lucullus dines with Lucullus?" Well, Lucullus and his kind were men of great appetite, not only for luxury, not only for food, but also for power. And that power rested in their legions. Such might was made possible by the general Marius, who in 107 BC introduced an innovation that completely reshaped the army and ultimately upset the balance of power in the Republic. He did this by throwing out the financial requirements for enlistment and accepting volunteers from the whole citizen body. The poor proletarians rushed in to be equipped and paid by the state, while the other classes, who were growing less enthusiastic about military service because they had better things to do at home, stayed out altogether. Army pay was not very good even for a proletarian. But a successful commander could be expected to provide his men with a share of the spoils or a parcel of land on discharge. And these rewards, which could substantially improve a man's life, were under the control of the general. It followed from this that the Roman legions were no longer loyal to the state, but to their commanders. Consider the Roman general Pompey, who lived from 106 to 48 BC. At the age of 28, Pompey was commissioned to raise an army to protect the Senate from other overly ambitious generals. He put down one major rebellion, but in the process his army became a private army, even to the point that his soldiers directed their oath of loyalty, not to Rome, but to him personally. A general with such an army behind him could then dominate or intimidate the Senate into giving him other commands and honors. And from there, it was only a short step to using his power to brush aside the senators and legalize his hold on the state as well. This is what happened with Pompey and a number of others, until it became clear to every thinking Roman that the days of the Republic were numbered. It had become a government not of law, but of men, ambitious, powerful, ruthless men. The generals and their legions had proved so successful that Rome controlled an extraordinary amount of territory by the middle of the 1st century BC. But this expansion also brought with it new threats. In the east, there was the growing power of the Parthian Empire, which had taken the place of the Persians. In the north, there was the thundercloud of hostile Germanic peoples. In the south, there were Arab raids in Asia and Numidians in Africa, and even inside the Roman state, a lot of provinces were muttering volcanoes. The provincial governors appointed by Rome were changed each year, and their performance depended completely on their individual character. There was no permanent civil service to provide stability. Here we see provincial peasants paying their taxes. The revenues from the provinces were the chief source of income for Rome, and tax collection was invariably farmed out to joint stock companies of Roman capitalists who paid the state only a fraction of what they extorted from the native people. Something had to change, but what? The necessary reforms could not come from the Senate because it was too conservative and it was losing its grip anyway. And reforms were not likely to come from the radicals either, since they were mostly demagogues interested in power. So a lot of Romans began to think that the Republic would have to be replaced, probably by a single ruler. The question then arose of who that ruler was going to be, because in the chaotic conditions of the 1st century BC, several great men faced each other, each with his own army, each claiming to stand for Rome, each trying to keep it in his grasp. In the end, this struggle left Julius Caesar victorious. He took power in 46 BC, and at once the Senate rushed to load him with honors. The honor he liked best was the right to wear the triumphal laurel wreath at all times, because this made his baldness less conspicuous. But there were more serious advantages. He was voted consul and the first dictator for life. The month of his birth was called by his name, July. And he was given the title of Imperator, which used to mean simply victorious general, but which came to mean what it now signifies: emperor, sovereign ruler. Caesar did not live long to enjoy his power. After only 2 years of dictatorship, he was murdered in the Senate in 44 BC by men who were not willing to see the Republic die so easily. But the Republic was doomed in spite of the senators' efforts. There was another period of anarchy and bloody struggle before Julius Caesar's grandnephew, Octavian, vanquished his uncle's enemies and his own. In 31 before Christ, at the Battle of Actium, he defeated his last serious rival, Mark Antony, who had allied himself with the last Ptolemy queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. And so, Octavian was now the absolute master of the empire. He inherited all of Caesar's powers, and he increased them further. Within 4 years of Actium, the Senate conferred upon him a combination of military and religious titles, Emperor Augustus, and so he too got a month of his own. The greatest monument to the long reign of Augustus was going to be the Pax Romana, the longest period of peace and stability the Mediterranean world has ever known.
Augustus's two main props were the imperial bureaucracy and the imperial army of defense, which were both under his authority. Although ostensibly he ruled with the Senate, he saw to it that the Senate was colonized by his men and that the imperial civil service, which was nominally under Senate scrutiny, was filled with his choices too. In fact, he dominated everything.
These civil servants would prove indispensable to the sprawling empire, and the growing number of administrators reflected a new degree of social mobility and opportunity, because these people were being recruited from the general body of citizens, not just the patricians. Sometimes they might even be ex-slaves or freedmen. At the same time, Augustus tried to reawaken Rome's citizens to their civic duties in order to keep them loyal to the state. He tried very hard to revive the old Roman virtues, using Roman history and legends very much as American history was once used to discourage small children from telling lies, or to encourage adults to patriotism and enterprise. All this, however, depended on the army, or rather on the fundamental stability and security that only the army could provide. Under Augustus, and for some time thereafter, every army commander depended directly on the emperor, not on the Senate or the people. He was no longer an entrepreneur, recruiting soldiers and gambling on his own abilities. He was an employee of the state who could be transferred from one army to another, just as generals are today. Except for the household troops of the emperor, the Praetorian Guard, shown here, the great bulk of the army was based along the frontiers, strung out in small garrisons and fortified camps along thousands of miles of imperial boundaries. Meanwhile, the old aggressiveness was disappearing, partly because everyone was heartily sick of fighting, and partly because, in the long run, war has to pay. And there were few enemies with wealth worth conquering around the border, and those who did border Rome were very tough indeed. From now on, the biggest threat would be the poor and hungry barbarians trying to get inside rich Roman territory. And so the army became a defensive force, increasingly expert in building border fortifications like this one on the Danube. It was not very interested in expansion anymore because expansion would only cost money and strain the administration without bringing any tangible benefits. There was little treasure in the lands of the barbarians, only trouble. But the imperial army was more than just a thin wall strung out around the empire. Its permanent camps became centers of urban development, centers of Roman civilization. Many of the great cities of Europe were born as army camps, from Vienna and Budapest to York, from Lisbon and Bordeaux to Cologne.
The centuries of security that the Roman army ensured, and the roads it built, and the settlements it created, allowed Greco-Roman culture to take root so deeply that even when the barbarian invaders eventually broke through, they were not able to dispel it. A lot of our culture today is owed in no small part to those legions.
Each army outpost bore the signs of Roman life, from its temples and public buildings to its theaters and baths. We talked earlier about the impact of Greek philosophy and learning. Now, in the West, with a mark of Rome everywhere, education in Latin became an important vehicle for social mobility, especially for civil servants. And it was also a vehicle for socialization to teach the conservative values of the Roman ruling class. In architecture, the Romans developed the dome and large-scale vaulting and the whole concept of vast, impressive interior space that had not much interested the Greeks. These were spectacular architectural advances. Still, to a layman like myself, the main contribution of the Romans was to take Greek designs and make them larger and grander. Roman architecture also made vast advances in engineering. Roman sculpture reflects Roman practicality. It brought a new realism to the Greek models, which Romans had been copying for centuries. You can see it especially in the portrait busts of the emperors, which were to be found in every corner of the empire.
Augustus and his Pax Romana preserved the Roman or Greco-Roman tradition. Without him, Rome would have lost her conquests one by one and seen them relapse into barbarism or degenerate into petty tyrannies. The barbarians of the east and the north would have invaded Roman territories centuries before they did. A parochial Rome would certainly have been destroyed by civil war, and the great institutions of Hellas would have been choked by debris instead of being carried forward by conscientious Roman students. And when Christianity came in during the 1st century AD, this imperial Roman tradition, which the reforms and the will of Augustus had made possible, would profoundly influence the organization and the thinking of the church. The imperial tradition would Romanize Christianity, would help make it the great organized, centralized, bureaucratized institution it eventually became, quite literally the Church of Rome, as we shall see next time.
The Roman Empire withstood war and the madness of its rulers until the stamp of Greco-Roman culture was left on Europe and on the Mediterranean world. Among those affected were the Jews, and through Jews a new heresy spread that would transform the West. Early Christianity, this time on the Western tradition.
The story of the Roman Empire can be simply told. The 2 centuries that opened with the Emperor Augustus were a time of peace and prosperity. There were crazy emperors and murderous emperors and murdered emperors, but the empire marched on. The Mediterranean was full of ships, the roads were safe, the borders were well guarded. Greco-Roman civilization seemed so stable, in fact, that it was taken as the ultimate structure of the world. History was no longer a process, but the record of how civilization got to be so stable and perfect. And politics were not about how things should go, but how things should be kept the way they were. The 3rd century, however, was a time of troubles, of war, of civil war, until the reign of Diocletian from 284 to 305, which was a period of reorganization and reconstruction. For nearly another century there was relative peace, but after that everything went to pieces. The economy cracked, the provinces were invaded by a barbarian, Rome itself was sacked, and in 476 Romulus Augustulus retired to the country, the last emperor to rule from Rome over the western part of the empire. And so the end came just about 5 centuries after the Battle of Actium and the beginning of the Peace of Augustus.
It was a remarkable run. As Edward Gibbon, the 18th century historian, wrote, instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it subsisted so long. The real turning point came not in the 5th century, but way back in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, when Rome realized that she was mortal, and when the calm confidence of an earlier age lapsed into something more anxious, more uneasy, increasingly decadent. You can chart the change in the portraits of the emperors. This is a bust of Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 and who was one of the best emperors Rome ever had. He seems to have grown old with a sense of humor and a certain skepticism. 50 years later, however, emperors, just like their subjects, looked sad or worse. This is a portrait of Marcus Aurelius, a Stoic who ruled from 161 to 180. He was an excellent emperor, but one who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. From that time on, the emperors range from sad to worried, as in this portrait of Decius, to brutish, like the Emperor Caracalla, or to simply insane, like the young Commodus, son and successor of Marcus Aurelius, who rejected the rationalism of the Stoics and invoked the protection of every Oriental deity in the book. Cybele, the great mother from Asia Minor, Mithras from Persia, Isis from Egypt, and any other god who promised salvation or immortality.
So in the course of 1 century, the Romans shifted from confidence and stability to anxious uncertainty. And their view of the world shifted as well, especially in religion and philosophy. Back in the 2nd century BC, when Rome first became open to Greek ideas, the philosophy that became popular was Stoicism. You remember that for the Stoics, the basis of morality was conformity with nature. Not only one's truly human nature, but also that of the divine world order. The wise man perceived true nature and true order and conformed to them. The Romans adapted this to their needs by emphasizing self-mastery, temperance, courage, dedication. But they also learned the universal humanitarian ideas of Stoicism and their limited original notion of virtu as manliness in the service of the state. This was enlarged and enriched. The old parochial morality was broadened into a new humanism.
Men like Cicero tried to apply humanism to the practical problems of political and social life. Born in 106 BC, Cicero, shown here, was a Roman orator, statesman and philosopher until his outspokenness against Mark Antony and Octavian got him killed. It was in the name of a more humane philosophy that the Stoic Seneca became the tutor and then the counselor of the young Emperor Nero, until Nero accused him of conspiracy and ordered him to take his own life. And it was Stoic philosophy that helped justify a princeps like Augustus, a first citizen, that is, who would be the wise and virtuous protector of the state. The Stoics had transformed the Platonic notion of a philosopher king into the idea that all men were equal in essence, but not in ability or virtue. There were a few superior souls, like Augustus, who had pressed through to lighter knowledge, and these alone could conceive and carry out what was good. And many of the reforms of Augustus reflected this conception of the exceptional man, a man with a mission who set out to re-establish and secure the balance and harmony of the world that were threatened by excess and corruption. Hence Augustus's efforts to restore the old moral virtues, to reaffirm traditional marriage, to re-establish old religious practices and the religious rituals of old Rome. This, incidentally, is a shrine in a sacred landscape. To train and to hone a ruling elite based on Greco-Roman humanism, whose values would still be taught in school in the 19th and 20th centuries. But this Augustan restoration, which lasted a long time, ultimately proved precarious because it depended on exceptional individuals to handle an immense and overwhelming task, the governing of an empire. And these outstanding individuals were not always available. The restoration was also shaky, because the culture that was offered to, or rather imposed upon, the lower classes by Augustus, this clashed with a brutishness and irrationality that was common among the lower classes. And rationality sat uneasily on the upper classes as well, so when hard times came, it proved a veneer easy to discard. Augustus tried to introduce an ascetic, elitist philosophy good for the brightest and best. These men were told that public service was their duty and that power had to be exercised only to good ends and then with moderation. But the religious rituals were too businesslike, too cool for hot periods, and the philosophy was too demanding for normal people. So when security collapsed and the economy broke down, danger and death were more on their minds and in their art. Stoicism was replaced by new ideas and new aspirations. What most people wanted as times grew hard was something more personal, more accessible, and they expressed this by saying that they wanted salus, a word which originally meant simply physical health, but which came to mean the health of the soul, that is, salvation. Stoic humanism might be good for a philosopher like Seneca, but the psychotic Emperor Nero did not want to be told what to do, and Seneca's stoicism came in handy when Nero asked him to commit suicide. A century later, Stoicism led Marcus Aurelius to write his Meditations, but his son and successor Commodus was a crazy lout, less interested in inner fortitude than in magic salvation. By that time, Roman culture was running hard just to stand still. Respectable citizens were trying to plumb the great unknown by way of seances like this one. Emperors prayed for miracles to get them out of tight spots. And ordinary people relied on religious charms, astrologers and soothsayers, and lots of amulets.
If you're caught in an air raid and the bombs are falling, you know that virtue or wisdom or strength make no difference, and you pray for divine intervention. That's what happened as the 2nd century slipped into the 3rd and the 4th. In politics, in thought, in the arts, the realism and naturalism and the sense of perspective that were part of a rational attitude to nature and the world, these gave way. The more disorder grew, the less relevant rationality seemed. The more the empire cracked, the less self-discipline and self-reliance seemed to work, the more doctrines of salvation offered a promise of escape. Which brings me to Christianity. There are 3 things we have to bear in mind when we look at early Christianity. First, the cultural context of a Hellenistic world all around it. Second, the Jewish sources of the new creed and the Jewish influences on it. And third, the changes in the contemporary world between the 1st century when Christianity was born and the 4th century when it was recognized by the Roman state. In other words, the ways in which the world affected Christianity and the ways in which Christianity affected the world.
If we begin by looking at the dominant Hellenistic culture of the ancient world, we find that it had been deeply infiltrated by Orientalism, especially as regards religion. This, for example, is a Roman figure clad in Egyptian clothes. And this is a scene from one of the mystery religions, or from a Gnostic cult claiming to offer access to gnosis, or knowledge of spiritual mysteries. These cults were most popular among women and among the lower classes, for whom they had been greatly simplified and vulgarized. They were not new, but their importance in the Hellenistic Greco-Roman world was new. Speaking in general terms, we might describe that world as skeptical, tolerant, and materialistic, This, for example, is a pillow merchant doing business in the marketplace. But it was above all, perhaps, a cosmopolitan world in which, under Roman rule, tribes and races intermingled within the same empire. In the midst of this, only the Jews really kept their identity and their uncompromising Semitic outlook. The word Semitic, remember, refers back to the Semites, a people who moved from the Arabian desert into Mesopotamia more than 2,000 years before Christ. The Hebrews were Semites, and so were the people we now call Arabs. The Jews especially were children of an idea. The idea of Jehovah, a God of supreme universal significance and power, but with whom they had a particular, unique and exclusive relationship. It was this idea that kept them alive as a people through years of trial and tribulations, alive and also jealously aloof from other religious influences in the world around them. Although Hellenistic influences affected the Jews as they affected everybody else, they affected them first in a contrary fashion, by making them resist assimilation, by stirring their nationalism, and by forcing them to reconsider and reform their religious attitudes and their ethics. In the year 175 before Christ, Antiochus IV, who ruled Syria and Palestine, started a campaign designed to unify his realm by wiping out competing religions and traditions. And so he prohibited circumcision and dietary laws, which were central to Judaism. The Jews, of course, refused to give up their traditions. They refused to worship Antiochus IV as a god, to subordinate their religion to the state. The friction got worse until it finally erupted in the bloody Maccabean revolt of 164 BC. That was so bloody and murderous that even today the French slang for corpse is macabre. These are coins struck by the new Maccabean rulers. As often happens, the results of the revolt went well beyond the practical issues that set it off. And in this case, the chief result was mainly that in resistance, the Jewish religion survived as a distinct and very self-conscious belief. If Antiochus had succeeded, if Judaism as such had died out, neither Christianity nor Mohammedanism in the form they actually took would have existed. But as it happened, the persecutions and the fighting produced a sort of revival of Judaism, partly as a nationalistic manifestation, partly as a search for consolation. War was hell, life was hell, and so, just to make up for it, the Jews started to think of heaven. They took over ideas of immortality from the Gnostics, and they did this partly to encourage themselves and their friends not to bow to Antiochus and to the Syrian gods. Look at it this way. If you had to choose between sticking to Jehovah and being burnt, or worshipping a barbarian god like Baal and staying alive, you could take comfort and fortitude from the fact that if you were burnt, you would be rewarded afterwards in eternity, which is a long time. On the other hand, if you broke your compact with Jehovah, life was short, and you would be very sorry afterwards. The Hellenistic influence, which was rejected by the Jews when he tried a frontal attack, was, however, going to affect Jewish thought in more subtle ways through the ethical developments of Pharisaic philosophy. The Pharisees were a religious sect given to piety, earnest prayer, strict observance of Jewish law, but also to interpreting the law of Moses in the context of changing situations. Jewish observance in general centered increasingly on reading the law and the scriptures in the synagogue, discussing them, interpreting them. This was a habit which led people to think for themselves and to listen to others around them who were developing notions to be found less in the scriptures than in current thought. Belief in an immortal soul, in angelic spirits, in personal resurrection, in free will reconciled with predestination.
So with one ear to Hellenistic culture and another to their inner voice, the Pharisees were going to evolve most of the socially significant ideas which have since come down to us in the New Testament. The Sermon on the Mount is a perfect reflection of early Pharisaic doctrine. For those of you who know it, here is a passage that may sound familiar. Love ye one another from the heart, and if a man sin against thee, speak peaceably to him, and in thy soul hold no guile. And if he repent and confess, forgive him. But if he deny it, do not get into a passion with him, lest catching the poison with thee, he take to swearing, and so sin doubly. And if he be shameless and persist in wrongdoing, even so forgive him from the heart, and leave to God the avenging.
This passage was written by Jews over a century before the birth of Christ. It comes from the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which was written between 109 and 107 BC, and which later proved extremely popular with St. Paul, and was probably known to Christ as well. Now, obviously, we cannot understand Christianity unless we realize that it was the product of this long development and interaction of thought and religion within and upon the Jewish people. Jesus, after all, was a Jew and probably a rabbi who followed Jewish law. And Christianity was first preached by Jews to Jews as a sort of reformed Judaism. Jesus won a considerable following among Jews, especially among the poor, until his success provoked the hostility of the Jewish establishment, which did not find it difficult to convince the Roman governor that Jesus was a dangerous radical. So the Romans put him to death in Jerusalem, probably in 30 AD. But it's important to realize that from the first, Christianity claimed to be not a break from, but the continuation and the fulfillment of the great history of the Old Testament, which promised a Messiah, a Redeemer, who would make Israel and the Jewish people triumph over their enemies.
The Christians inherited a lot of things from the Jews, including the Semitic sense of world worthlessness and the conflict between body and spirit. And they took over, too, the typically Jewish vision of a blinding, all-powerful God above and the abject condition of man below, with his overwhelming sense of sin and a passion for salvation. But this salvation could not come from anything man could do, as the rationalist Greeks might have argued, but only from God, or, as St. Paul later put it, from faith in God. which in Christian terms is simply faith in the reality and value of Christ's sacrifice. However, there is one thing to remember about all this. At the beginning, in order to be a Christian, you had to be a Jew. There was no thought of separateness in Christian communities which were merely reformed religious groups within a Jewish community.
An obscure Jewish sect follows the teachings of a heretical prophet who claims he is the Son of God. How did the cult of Christ withstand the might of the Roman Empire and then become its ally? The rise of the Church, this time on the Western tradition.
Last time we ended at the dawn of Christianity when Christ and his disciples were preaching to their fellow Jews a sort of Reformed Judaism, where the long tradition of the Hebrew prophets promised the coming of a Messiah who would establish the kingdom of God on earth. Jesus seems to have preached that there would be no kingdom, but instead a day of judgment coming very soon when the wicked would be punished and the righteous rewarded. And so the message was, abandon all sin while you still have time. This was definitely a departure from orthodoxy, but even so, there was no thought of separateness in Christian communities until, that is, St. Paul came along.
Paul was a Roman citizen born in the city of Tarsus in Asia Minor. He was a rabbi and a Pharisee, in other words, a very pious Jew, and as a pious Jew, he persecuted Christians whom he regarded as heretics and a menace to Judaism. But around 35 AD, 5 years after the crucifixion of Christ, Paul had a vision on the road to Damascus, and he became convinced that Jesus was the Son of God. Here is a 15th century version of Paul's conversion. Paul turned out to be the great organizer, the great public relations manager of the young faith, and in effect he made Christianity competitive with other religions. He enlarged its scope by recruiting outside the restricted group of people who obeyed Jewish law. He admitted non-Jews without asking them to be circumcised first, and without insisting they respect the ritual laws, especially the laws concerning food. He probably did it because he was in a hurry. The end of the world was coming, and you couldn't quibble over trifles. But it's worth remembering that Paul and his like were able to spread Christianity because of Roman roads and Roman peace, as well as his skill and the religion's appeal. It was Rome that linked the Mediterranean world together. Equally important was the Koine, the Greeks' common dialect which spread from east to west, making all the Mediterranean a bilingual world where traveling men could make themselves understood everywhere. St. Paul wrote to the Romans in Greek, and until early in the 3rd century AD, the language of Christian liturgy in the Church of Rome was Greek. It was also into Greek that the Hebrew scriptures had been translated 2 centuries before Christ. That extremely important translation was finished in Hellenistic Alexandria with its great Jewish community. It was called the Septuagint, from the Latin for 70, because there were supposed to have been 70 translators. And so it was ready for early Christian missionaries when they began to carry their message through the world. In the synagogues, which you could find in Hellenistic cities like this one, Adura Eropos, the translations of the Hebrew scriptures were read and studied. And I don't think the early Christian church would have gone very far, or Paul either, without the Septuagint and the synagogue, and without writing the New Testament in the Greek Koine from the very beginning.
So here you have a crucial interconnection of factors. First, the conquests of the Roman Empire, which unify the Mediterranean world. Second, the Hellenistic creation of a common speech for this world. Both were preconditions for the advance of Christianity. However, as time went on, the Jews became increasingly hostile to Christians, and the Christians also became more and more hostile to the Jews. To the Jews, the Christians were heretics. To the Christians, the Jews were willfully blind to what was so evident and so evidently holy. And so Christianity separated from Judaism. It left the fairly straightforward path of Jewish religious thought, and moving westward along both shores of the Mediterranean, it started to appeal to a new public and to develop a theology of its own. This advance of Christianity was spurred in the second half of the first century by a great Jewish rising against Rome and a wave of anti-Semitism that swept over the East about the same time. But then the Roman general Titus put down the uprising and sacked the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. This is the Roman procession with the spoils of Jerusalem. At this point, the Christians were still pretty much a Jewish sect, and they were emotionally affected by the humiliating defeat. But then two things happened. On the one hand, a lot of Christians were left with an abiding hatred of secular power. On the other hand, as you can tell from this coin with the inscription "Judea taken captive," established Jewish communities and the power of Orthodox Jewish religion temporarily collapsed, so the Christians found it easier to break free. The earthly Jerusalem had been destroyed, so that now the ideal version could be better projected into heaven without having to worry about real nations and real governments. The result of all this can be found in the suggestion made by Origen, a Christian teacher who lived in Alexandria in the 3rd century. Origen wrote that Christians should not take part in the government of the state, but that their only concern should be the divine nation, that is, the church. Some churchmen went even further, denying the world and their own bodies, which in the dichotomy between spirit and flesh came out a poor second. They gave away their property, they fasted, they flagellated themselves, and Origen advocated complete chastity, probably had himself castrated. If the church had heeded Origen, its story would have ended there. But fortunately, St. Paul suggested it was better to marry than to burn. Still, the unworldly anti-secular ideas of Origen remained influential, and as the Roman Empire disintegrated, churchmen looked on with some detachment. They exercised their talents in bitter theological controversies, and in the spread of monastic communities like this one in Greece, cut off from the wicked world where Christians could concentrate on personal salvation and spend their lives in contemplation and penitence. It can be argued, and it was argued even at the time, that this attitude was a sort of sour grapes, a retreat from the world when the world became too hard to bear, denying earthly values in order to secure oneself against their loss. It can also be argued, however, that when you deny certain values, you are, at least by implication, you are affirming alternative values. But to many people of that time, even this positive aspect looked uncommonly like a negative one. And to understand this, we have to imagine what these early Christians looked like to the respectable property owners of the first 3 centuries after Christ. To begin with, many people thought the Christians were crazy or drunk.
The resurrection of Christ and the ascension were incompatible with natural science, and for a late pagan intellectual to accept the incarnation of God in the human form as Jesus would be like a modern man denying the evolution of species. He would have to abandon not just the most advanced rational knowledge available, but by implication the whole Greco-Roman culture that had been marked by that knowledge. But the ultimate accusation was the one that the high priest brings to the Roman governor against St. Paul when he complains, "We have found this man to be a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." And this is the point. These Christians are dangerous. They insist that all men are brothers, that the beggar is as good as the solid citizen, that the slave is equal to his master in essence, if not in fact, since this doesn't prevent Christians from keeping slaves. All in all, they deny the value of everything society holds dear. The Good Shepherd offers salvation, not money, or family, or property, or success, or service to the state. Leave thy father and thy mother and thy brother and follow me. What good will all this do you if you have lost your own soul? What was even worse, the Christians even denied the final power of the emperor and the ultimate value and worth of imperial power and imperial justice. By all means render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, but there's a limit to what belongs to Caesar, and this means that for the Christians there is a higher power than the state. There is an ultimate good or aim which may not be the ultimate good or aim of the state. And if that aim, God's aim, clashes with that of Caesar, there is no doubt about whom the Christian must follow. Think for a minute of the revolutionary character of such ideas being spread around a society where material values reign supreme, ideas which found particular favor with the proletariat, especially around the ports and the Levantine cities. It's a society where gods, like Diana here, were anthropomorphic with human form and personality, where the emperor was God, where imperial unity called increasingly for religious unity and for the subordination of private opinions to the state. So Christians were dangerous and they were subversive because their success threatened not just the state but the whole established, accepted basis of social life and social values. When Christ says, "My kingdom is not of this world," he means that the world is irrelevant, which challenges every Stoic notion of civic duty. When he says, "Repent, for the kingdom of God is near," the kingdom of God means the end of politics on earth insofar as you define politics as a reasonable attempt to organize human society. On the other hand, a lot of what the Christians said could have fitted the Stoic tradition. The focus on individual salvation, the heavenly city to which the pure and high-minded aspire, the rejection of social or national differences, above all the high moral values. They all sounded familiar, or they could be made to sound familiar. And so, on another level, did the mystic aspect of Christianity and its promise of a special revelation, a special road to salvation, just like the other so-called mystery religions, the cults of Mithras, of Isis, and so on. But the real secret weapon of the Christians was that they soon developed a tight-knit, disciplined organization
that stretched all over the empire. It all began with the fact that Christians had a book, the Bible, full of potent promises and stories of miracles that bore out the tales attested to by people who were practically contemporaries. The Christians, being a practical group, meeting and reading and having discussions about the Gospels, took advantage of Roman respect for tombs to organize themselves legally as burial societies. And this is one of their catacombs, their underground burial tunnels. This meant that even when the authorities persecuted the Christians, they generally respected their catacombs, at least until the 3rd century, when the Christians were already pretty well organized. There was also the fact that while Christianity was just as mysterious as any other mystery cult, it was much cheaper to join. Initiation as a worshipper of Mithras called for a bull. Initiation into the cult of Isis called for a whole series of gifts and sacrifices. But if you wanted to worship Christ, there were no initial expenses, and most church meetings were rather like highly emotional Sunday school picnics. It was pleasant, and it was economical. But if you wanted to, and you probably did want to, you could give alms to the church. By the 3rd century, the church had become rich. Almsgiving was a judicious transfer of capital from this world to the next, a sort of fire insurance. These contributions and legacies accumulated in the hand of the bishops and were devoted almost exclusively to charity, and not just for Christians either. You can imagine what a tremendous lever of power this Christian charity must have been as the imperial Roman organization disintegrated, as misery increased, as the great cities crowded with starving poor, as men were thrown out of work or off their lands by barbarians or nobles or tax collectors. And the Christian bishops who controlled the arms were often the only honest men around, or the only honest, powerful men around. The provincial governors and other magistrates were mostly blue-blooded ninnies appointed for a year or two to act as the figurehead of an ill-paid and hence corruptible staff. And so in the 3rd century, the bishop stands out as a permanent figure in his town, dedicated to his job, to his flock, and responsible only to God. And then by the next century, he also offers something everybody wants, a free, quick, uncorrupt settlement of lawsuits by arbitration. And this is sought by pagans and heretics as much as it is by Christians. So the church became a force to be reckoned with until by the 4th century it was officially recognized by the Roman state. That happened after yet another civil war between rivals to the throne of the empire ended with the victory of Constantine, who enlisted the support of the Christians against his chief opponent, who worshipped Sol Invictus, the invincible sun, as most soldiers did then. Constantine, who was emperor from 306 to 337, was given to visions and conversions. He had shifted from one god to another before. This time, however, a vision told him that the sign of the cross would bring him victory. And so he put the cross on his banner and on the shields of his soldiers, and it worked. In 312, Constantine defeated his chief rival, Maxentius, at the Milvian Bridge near Rome. And soon after this, his Edict of Milan
granted full toleration to the church and freedom of worship to all Christians. It also established an alliance between the Christian church and the Roman state that was going to last a very long time. Within a few decades, tolerance for Christians turned into the right for Christians to be intolerant of any other faith or church and to tear down temples like this temple of Artemis in Jordan. Around 400, public paganism was suppressed, the temples were closed everywhere, the statues broken up, often by Christian mobs, and the proud inscriptions proclaiming the unshakable alliance of cities and their gods were carted away to pave the public highways. For the Jews during this period, there were pogroms, organized massacres which enlisted the anti-Semitism of the urban Greeks in the cause of God.
For the pagans, there was the closing of the schools, the closing of temples, persecution, sometimes lynchings, as happened with Hypatia, a distinguished lady of Alexandria who went in for philosophy and mathematics. As described by Edward Gibbon, the historian who didn't like early Christians very much, Hypatia was torn from her chariot, stripped naked, dragged to the church, and inhumanely butchered by a troop of savage, merciless fanatics. Her flesh was scraped from the bones with sharp oyster shells, and her quivering limbs were delivered to the flames. The just progress of inquiry and punishment was stopped by seasonable gifts. Thus, Gibbon.
By the time this happened in 415, the Christians were reserving most of their passion for fighting each other, and they invested far more fury and energy in persecuting fellow Christians than they did in hurting non-Christians, especially as non-Christians were becoming ever more scarce. What you get now is the clash of groups holding strong views on things like diet, marriage, property, clothing, which could and often did lead to violence. Above all, you get doctrinal discord about the Trinity, the union of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, which is a difficult concept anyway, and especially about the nature of Christ himself. Is Christ a man who becomes God? Is he a God who temporarily becomes a man? Is he a God who is God and man at the same time? And is he equal to God the Father, or subordinate as a son should be? This may sound like hair splitting, but a lot of blood was shed and a lot of people suffered for each of these views. Rival doctrines also became associated with this region or that. They became part of what we might call a national or tribal identity.
For example, the city of Constantinople stood for a Christian God who combines two natures in one. Alexandria stood for one nature only. From then on, when one province or people or political party fought another, it would very often be as orthodox against heretic on behalf of one doctrine or another. As long as Christians had been part of an alternative society, their shrines had been harbors in a world ruled by demonic powers. But now, the alternative to society had become the society. The shrines proclaimed the greatness of God and of his church, and they also provided arenas where battles between Christians could be fought out. The Christian himself had been an athlete in Christ, committed to a wrestling match, an agon, as the Greeks called it, a match against evil and darkness and his own lower nature. Now that the churches were full, he could wrestle against those whose idea of truth, especially Christian truth, was different from his own. And this was to bring centuries of conflict, as we shall see in the programs ahead.
Was it the barbarians who sapped the strength of the Roman Empire? Was it disease? Was it Christianity? Was it taxes that caused its decadence, or was it just another ancient empire that could not adjust when circumstances changed too radically? The decline of Rome, this time on the Western tradition.
In the 6th century, a Roman nobleman was dragooned into becoming pope, which wasn't the most comfortable of jobs in those days. Eventually, that gentleman would be known as Gregory the Great, and he would be canonized as Saint Gregory. But by this time, there hadn't been an emperor living in Rome for nearly 200 years, or one in Italy for 100.
In fact, all the territory from Hadrian's Wall in Britain to the Adriatic Sea and beyond was now dominated by a number of backward, warlike tribes, most of them German. The western part of the empire was no more. The emperor ruled in Constantinople, and though some of his ships and troops still held a few Italian ports, most of the peninsula was occupied by barbarians. Pope Gregory believed that the end of the world was near. After all, the empire was staggering to its end, so Judgment Day must be nigh. Gregory also thought that volcanoes were the gates of hell and that their mouths were growing larger in order to admit the increasing number of damned souls. Although Gregory was anxious to mitigate the suffering and still the turmoil around him, the main business of life in such circumstances was to prepare for death. In one of his sermons, Gregory looked back from the disorder and misery of his own age. Everywhere death, mourning, desolation, as he said in one of his sermons, to the material prosperity of earlier times when Christians were martyrs to their faith. In those days, the beginning of the 2nd century when Trajan was emperor, there was long life and health, said Gregory, material prosperity, growth of population and the tranquility of daily peace. Yet, while the world was still flourishing in itself, in their hearts it had already withered. You might call Gregory's description of better days sour grapes, but it does raise the question of how a prosperous, lawful, advanced society gave way to darkness and to chaos. The first and obvious answer is that the Roman Empire of the 2nd century was surrounded by darkness and chaos, by a host of backward, hungry, savage tribes across the Tyne, the Rhine, and the Danube rivers, not to mention the mountains and deserts of Asia and Africa. As long as these tribes were held in check, they mostly fought each other. Individuals often trickled into the empire to look for work or sign on as mercenaries, and some of them settled as immigrants do today and became Romanized. But when they could, They burst through over the border to raid and loot and ravage as a tribe, and when the opportunity offered, instead of turning back home with their plunder, they might even take over the better lands of the empire itself and settle there until someone else came and pushed them off. After 250 AD or thereabouts, this process accelerated. The raids became invasions, and the emperors bent all their energies to stabilizing what was left and keeping the barbarians at bay, sometimes by hiring a group of barbarian mercenaries to fight on behalf of Rome. Better still, the Romans would try to persuade one tribe to fight another so that they would be too busy to threaten Rome. But around the year 214 before Christ, when the Chinese began to build a great wall to preserve their civilized world against barbarians, a federation of aggressive Mongol tribes had turned west. These were the people we call the Huns. As they traveled westward over the course of several centuries, the Huns pushed before them other warlike tribes, the Goths and the Vandals, who were desperate to get away from them, which tells you just how awful the Huns must have been. In the late 4th century, some of these fleeing peoples, notably the Goths, got into the Balkans, which were among the richest provinces of the empire, and from there into Italy. Then, around the year 406, many more Vandals crossed the frozen Rhine and ravaged Gaul. As one contemporary observer remarked, Gaul smoked to heaven in one continuous pyre. And after Gaul was devastated, they crossed into Spain and North Africa. In due course, the Huns followed, carrying even worse destruction wherever they went. After that, the West was a chaos of frightened Roman survivors and brawling savage tribes.
It's difficult to exaggerate the horror and suffering all this involved for generations. It wasn't war as we understand it, but robbery and mayhem on a vast scale exercised on an almost defenseless population, rather like an endless raid by motorcycle gangs. It meant the sack of cities, the massacre and enslavement of populations, and the devastation of open country. Attila the Hun, who led his people for 20 years in mid-5th century, was known as the Scourge of God. In 448 in the Balkans, Roman envoys to Attila found the once populous city of Naissus empty except for corpses. In Africa, a few years earlier, if a city refused to surrender, the Vandals would march their captives up to the walls and butcher them en masse so that the stench of their corpses should make defense untenable.
As St. Jerome wrote in 396, the mind shudders when dwelling on the ruin of our day. On every side sorrow, lamentation, everywhere the image of death. By Pope Gregory's time in the 6th century, chaos and mayhem had become a part of normal life. So the question becomes, how did it happen? Why was Rome unable to defend itself?
Edward Gibbon's great history, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, was published in London in the years between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And it attributes much of the responsibility for Rome's decline to the insidious effects of Christianity, which Gibbon thought was bad for the Roman fiber. He calls it the triumph of superstition. But it's interesting that Gibbon's story runs from the end of the 1st century to the 5th century, which is a pretty long incubation period for a mortal illness, especially when you consider that Gibbon was writing just when the British Empire was about to rise. Today, 2 centuries after Gibbon, the British Empire is no more, whereas just the decline of Rome took 4 centuries. And unlike Gibbon, most present-day historians concentrate not on Christianity, but on social, economic, constitutional factors, which is reasonable because those can be traced and measured to some extent. So let's take a look at them.
One of the most striking versions of the fall of Rome focuses on all the fertile soil, upland farms, well-drained or irrigated areas passing over generations into the hands of landlords who cultivated them by slave labor. The poorer areas, especially the marshland, were left to the peasants. In these marshes, the malaria mosquito bred. The disease and the poverty that resulted drove the victims into the cities, where they spread the infection and perhaps contributed to the feverish kind of city politics characteristic of Rome. Then, according to one theory, malaria, joined perhaps by smallpox or some other plague, moved outward to the frontiers of the empire, decimating the garrisons, depopulating the towns, eventually leading to the final breakthrough of the barbarians. If this theory is true, the Roman Empire was actually destroyed by a mosquito, which may not be so far-fetched if you consider that Alexander the Great had probably died of malaria. It has also been argued that short-sighted methods by farmers like this one exhausted the soil, impoverished smallholders, depopulated the countryside, and left little for the tax collector, hence little to pay the legions who were the protectors of the empire. According to another view, it was too heavy taxes that drove people off the land, and so the decay of agriculture was the result of tax burdens. Actually, both points are true, but neither is a sufficient explanation, since soil exhaustion was not general. For instance, Gaul and Egypt were pretty lush, and while taxation was general, some provinces fared better than others, especially when they were safe from invasion. There was, however, one problem which was basic to Hellenistic society in general and to the later Roman Empire in particular. The cities consumed without producing. As you might guess from this well-stocked bread shop in Pompeii, the cities ate up what the countryside produced, and they left little for the peasants, who grew increasingly desperate. This situation became more serious as barbarian pressure increased, and with it, economic pressure on the countryside became harder and harder to bear. The imperial administration was always concerned with keeping the big city population happy because it was more volatile and prone to riot. So the government offered what the Roman poet Juvenal called bread and circuses. Races, shows, games, displays of every sort, which had once offered occasional entertainment, now became an organic necessity. The symbol of all this was the Colosseum, which had been built in the 1st century. It could hold up to 50,000 people, and it seldom stood empty. Under the Republic, there had been 65 days of games a year. Their number increased steadily until by the 4th century they took up 175 days, half the year. The circus is their temple, said a contemporary observer. The Christians tried to put an end to gladiatorial combat, which declined after the 5th century. But chariot races and shows and bear baiting continued, and pantomimes, the more obscene the better. And though the church tried to restrain the passion, the crowds got their kicks by demanding a high degree of bloody realism, so that the actor who played Hercules in a show would really be burnt at the end, and a mime would be crucified and left to die. Only total ruin puts an end to the games in the 6th century. The bread, however, ran out long before the circuses. It, too, had changed from an occasional handout to a regular aspect of public assistance designed to mollify the urban crowd. There was free wine, free grain, oil, bacon, even money. There might be handouts equivalent to $10 or $15 or even $20 to 300,000 people or more. If the state was going to pay for all this, someone had to pay the state. Obviously, that would be the provinces, the producers, the rural population. This led to growing resentment of all those greedy, useless mouths in the city, or else it meant an attempt to join the useless mouths, who at least had some fun, to become a consumer rather than a producer, and this, of course, meant fewer producers and still more problems.
The cost of large-scale public assistance did not matter so much when the economy was reasonably stable. But when it was disrupted by civil war after the 2nd century and by foreign invasions after the 3rd, such burdens became serious. As the economy began to crack in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, the emperors concentrated on squeezing all the money and the goods they could in order to pay the army, or else to pay the barbarians whom the army no longer held in check. Now this meant that the economy entered a vicious downward spiral, and society with it. There were ever heavier taxes, ever fewer people capable of paying taxes. Inflation and debasement of the currency drove gold and silver out of circulation. Taxes were increasingly paid in kind, in grain, in cattle, in forced labor, or else they weren't paid at all. The economy, which had taken centuries to shift from barter to cash, slipped back to the primitive level of barter. And so this was another factor in the decline of Rome.
The principal cause of ruin, however, was probably hypertrophy, growing too big, which is the essential sickness of every ancient empire. A state grows, it eliminates one threat after another, it gobbles up competitors, and after a while the sheer cost of army and administration proves too much for the economy. Communications break down under the strain. Distant armies cannot be commanded from the center, and distant provinces break off. In the 280s, the Emperor Diocletian realized what was happening. He took a co-emperor who could look after the eastern part of the empire while he looked after the west. And then each of the two emperors took a vice-emperor. So the administration of the empire was split into four.
The future Emperor Constantine was the son of one of these vice-emperors. Constantine inherited his place in this tetrarchy, or government by quartet. You can still see a statue of the tetrarchs anxiously clinging to each other, which makes them look very chummy and more like medieval knights than Romans. The quartet did not last, but the duet did. The system of one empire with two emperors survived until the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by barbarians in 476. In the Eastern Empire, Constantine took the old Greek city of Byzantium on the Bosphorus. He enlarged it. He renamed it Constantinople and made it his capital in 330. Even so, the problems of scale would not go away. They had been manageable in peacetime, but they proved overwhelming when war became endemic in the 4th and 5th centuries. Finally and inescapably, there was the economic problem. And what we can say about Rome from scenes like this one applies more or less to every society up to the 15th or 16th century, and that is that every central power and every imperial court was not a producer but a consumer. A great city like Alexandria, Antioch, Rome was an octopus, with great tentacles reaching out to suck the substance of its hinterland or of the provinces. The cities created very little in terms of material riches. Buying power was low even in the great cities. Ordinary people lived crowded in narrow quarters, cramped, unheated, barely lighted by a small oil lamp, hardly furnished at all. They spent as little time as possible in these unattractive holes, and when they weren't working, they were in the street, in the forum, in the theater or circus or the baths, which were practically free.
So great as the empire was, it was economically anemic. There was little industrial production, there was little investment in enterprises that would increase the quantity of available goods and money and set them circulating. And this is one of the great differences between ancient and modern economies. Ancient capital, unlike modern capital, went either into buying land or else into usury, which is the lending out of money at extremely high interest rates. And there was little interest in new possibilities for technological change because production was generally limited to domestic economy, to what an individual home or estate needed, or else to luxury goods. Let me give you an example. About 2,000 years ago, an Alexandrian geometrician named Hero invented a steam engine which was perfectly practical and which embodied the principles of the turbine and of jet propulsion. But the point about the engine is not that he invented it, but that nobody used it. What made Hero well known was that he invented a lot of tricks and toys that could amuse rich people or serve the temple priests, like a contraption that produced steam in order to open temple doors so that the gods inside would be revealed without any human intervention. But none of this led to more practical applications.
There were, of course, plenty of slaves, and in any case, mechanics were not respectable, just as working with your hands wasn't respectable, which you can understand when you think that slaves and poor folk did it.
At any rate, nobody paid much attention to science in general and to technology in particular, except for warfare and for civil engineering. Aqueducts, sewers, public buildings, ingenious ways of heating baths, all of which were very advanced, very impressive, but not terribly productive.
And so the ancients reached the threshold of an industrial age, but they never crossed it. The world had to wait 1700 years after Hero to get a steam engine and all the joys that go with it. Which is not meant to suggest that the society was bad, but just that it wasn't flexible. It was not structured or equipped to adjust, to expand its means to the scale of its needs. And so when it had to adjust, all it could think of was to try to freeze things in place or to make them worse, tax more, control more, enforce and coerce and restrain, as we shall see next time.
As the pressure of the barbarians increased, the Roman emperors grew more despotic while their citizens grew more impoverished. Why did the empire finally run down? Or should the question be, why did it last as long as it did? The fall of Rome, this time on the Western tradition.
Last time we talked about the barbarian tribes which contributed to the decline of the Roman Empire, and also about the measures the emperors took to oppose them, which led to further decline. But when you talk about the barbarians, you have to put them in perspective. The population of the empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries was only between 50 and 65 million people, and this was for a realm that ran all the way from the Tyne River in northern England to the Euphrates. So the barbarians were able to have an impact far beyond their numbers.
Tribes of Germans and Huns might vary in size between 50,000 and 100,000 people, which meant between 5,000 and 20,000 warriors. But the indigenous populations were also small, and so were the Roman armies. As soon as one gang of barbarians was eliminated or assimilated, another came along, and then another. Some of the Roman emperors tried to position their troops so that they seemed to be everywhere at the same time, but this wasn't always an easy trick to pull off. After mid-3rd century, when the barbarians were everywhere, urban life changed radically for the worse. Towns used to be large, open centers of life and culture. But as you can see from this plan of a Roman town in Silchester, England, now they contracted and turned into fortified enclosures. You can still see the general lines of the town today. Extremely compact and easy to defend. Even a major city like Bordeaux shrank to 70 acres or so during this time. Life in these fortified towns became so dreary that the aristocrats deserted them for their country estates and built large fortified villas like this one. They hunted, they feasted and entertained their neighbors, and they developed a sort of rural life that would be normal for lords or country gentlemen for the next 15 centuries. In this context, the large landowner became a little local king. He didn't bother to pay his taxes, and no one could make him. He paid his own guards and men-at-arms. He administered the law on his estates and built his own prison and fed and protected his clients, who were really his subjects. And so, by the 4th century, the basis of the medieval economy and of the feudal system to come was pretty much in place. You can also see the breakdown of Roman civilization reflected in the arts. Statues of emperors and other great men were now made in 2 sections. A standardized body that could be imitated and shipped anywhere, and a particular head which tended to look more and more like a shepherd who has eaten his sheep. And the classic calm had given way to a pathetic expressionism. The elegant naturalism of Hellenistic art had been replaced by cruder figures, still classical, but stiffer, rougher.
More important, there was a decline in the competence of the emperors, which was bound to be serious in a system in which the emperor was everything, where the emperor's capacity and will were crucial. And in fact, under both Republic and Empire, Rome had a fundamental institutional problem: the inability to adjust institutions to the scale and the nature of changing realities. When the Republic got too big to handle, the Romans adjusted to it by accepting the personal government of Augustus and his successors. Nothing was codified, nothing was regulated. It was left to chance. And sometimes chance served Rome well, and sometimes it didn't.
On the whole, most of the 2nd century was a lucky break, because the murder of this man, the despotic Emperor Domitian, in 96 AD, opened the door to a succession of first-class rulers. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus, and Marcus Aurelius. But then Marcus Aurelius placed family feeling over logic in naming his successor. In 180, his son Commodus became emperor, a teenage megalomaniac who thought he was Hercules. He sacrificed to the gods large numbers of gladiators and beasts. He kept a harem of 300 female concubines and as many males, and he was finally assassinated. Good riddance. Commodus, depicted here as Hercules, opened a series of regimes in which brutish efficiency alternated with more or less absolute madness. It was a time when personal oppression could only be remedied by personal initiative, mainly in the shape of rebellion and murder. And since neither murderers nor victims could measure up to the immense problems the empire posed, things were bound to fall to pieces eventually. Part of the reason why it took so long lies in the maxim of Septimius Severus, who was emperor from 193 to 211. Severus told his sons, "Be united, enrich the soldiers, and scorn the rest." This was good advice, but it couldn't keep his son Alexander from being murdered by conspirators in his own army. And it couldn't prevent his grandson, Heliogabalus, from turning into a homosexual eccentric who gave himself up to debauchery. Heliogabalus became emperor in 218 at the age of 14, and he ruled only 4 years. He made the mistake of forgetting to pay his soldiers enough attention, and he was killed by his own Praetorian guards in a barracks latrine in a plot hatched by his own family. In fact, the whole 3rd century appears as a very dark period in the history of the empire, a period of anarchy during which the Praetorian Guard and the provincial armies contended to place their respective candidates upon the imperial throne, the office of emperor being auctioned off to the highest bidder. Behind this decay, there were also important social divisions. From the beginning of the 3rd century on, the army consisted almost entirely of peasants from the less civilized parts of the empire. And these peasant soldiers were in violent opposition to the urban middle classes who had provided the leadership in the Augustan Empire. So a struggle developed between a barely Romanized provincial army and the civilian elements of the population who were mostly Roman and who were trying to keep the peasant soldiers from taking over.
The situation was further complicated by the fact that each legion had been made responsible for its own recruiting. Remember that most of these legions were permanently quartered on the frontiers, which meant that they would naturally draw recruits either from their immediate locale or else, and even more likely, from barbarians across the borders. Now, this system de-Romanized the army even more, and it produced strong local tendencies that you might call nationalist. Soon the army of Gaul or of Illyria wanted its particular leader as emperor and no longer felt the old sentiment of imperial patriotism for a cosmopolitan kind of Rome. And this in turn accentuated the conflict for political power in which all the frontier armies were engaged.
Out of this century of chaos, there came a militarized empire and a pretty straightforward despotism under Diocletian at the end of the 3rd century, and then under Constantine at the beginning of the 4th. All this time, lip service was paid to the old Roman traditions, but in reality, the government was carried on by members of a military caste. The emperor was a soldier, and he appointed only soldiers to positions of authority in the central and the provincial administrations. This created a purely military aristocracy, and one that was continually reinforced by barbarian recruits. So the later empire was really an oriental monarchy with the trappings of a police state, a realm in which the citizen body no longer pursued its own ends, but became merely the exploited appendage of its so-called defenders, the legions. This is how a historian, J.W. Thompson, described the court of Diocletian. The emperor was a god and moved as an absolute sovereign reigning by divine right. It would be almost true to say that the Roman world trembled at the emperor's nod. The greater the barbarian pressure on the empire, the greater justification there seemed to be for this kind of despotism, social regimentation, extortionist taxation. But the more extreme the later emperors were in this direction, the more they centralized power, the more outrageously they taxed, the less Roman civilians felt they had to defend, the more they came to accept the coming of the barbarians almost as relief. At least barbarians didn't tax.
It has always been a problem for a society faced by a serious challenge to decide just what measures it can take and how far it can go in opposing and meeting that challenge. If you argue that you can only preserve your way of life by adopting certain means which negate that way of life, that you can only preserve democracy or free speech by limiting them, for example, or preserve a high standard of living by taxing and restricting it, or preserve liberty by regimentation, or moral order by inquisition, then you run the risk of sacrificing exactly the things you say you are fighting for. You run the risk of sacrificing precisely those things that you use to justify the sacrifices in the first place. And you risk becoming so like your enemy that the differences matter very little.
In the case of Roman society from the 4th century on, most of the civilians were less well off than the barbarians across the Rhine, especially if we set aside the small educated aristocracy leading a rather precarious existence in provinces like Gaul or North Africa. As for the soldiers, they were the barbarians. By the 4th century, the old Roman legion was no more, and the barbarian infantry serving as Roman soldiers didn't have the discipline to execute complicated maneuvers. In 378, the Emperor Valens led a Roman army that was almost annihilated at Adrianople by the heavily mailed cavalry of the Goths, and Valens was killed. This was probably the worst defeat the Romans had suffered since the days of Hannibal 6 centuries before. And the most important result of it was that the Emperor Theodosius, who succeeded Valens, decided that the infantry had become obsolete, and he hired in its place precisely the Gothic cavalry that had shown it to be so, and that had settled in Roman lands anyway after Adrianople. With this act, the corpse of Roman military tradition was formally buried, and the system that replaced it produced the Gothic warlords and their heavily armored cavalry. These were the soldiers who would supervise the dismemberment of the Western Empire in the 5th century. So it can be argued that the Roman Empire, which had been built in the first place by the Roman legions and the Roman farmers who fought in them, was bound to fall to pieces when the small independent farmer was extinct and the legions decayed partly for lack of him. After that, the soldiers we call Roman were all barbarians paid to fight other barbarians. Even high generals and officials running the state would themselves be barbarians, like the general Stilicho, a Vandal who was Emperor Theodosius's son-in-law. In 402, Stilicho moved the imperial court to Ravenna in the northeast, where it would be safer behind the marshes and where it would find it easier to escape by ship if the enemy got too close. So Italy was no longer a safe place for Romans. Rome itself was a sitting duck. And indeed, within a few years of the move to Ravenna, the inconceivable happened. In 410, an army of Goths under the command of Alaric, their king, entered the city and sacked it.
The fall of Rome was the symbol of the fall of a whole civilization, the end of its security, however imaginary it was by then, and the end of a whole way of life. The world one lived in could no longer be taken for granted. Saint Jerome, writing from Jerusalem, commented, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" So the end had finally come, and the search for the reasons why began. A search that would fascinate countless generations of historians. Messy politics over the succession of emperors was one reason. So was declining military power, and of course economic strangulation. But there was also a process of sociological decay, which gradually destroyed the foundations of the Roman Empire's strength. And this was in effect the victory of the Oriental model of despotic monarchy over the Mediterranean city-state, and the decline of Rome's urban citizen class under the pressure of that Oriental-like centralization and bureaucracy.
To understand why that happened, we have to keep in mind that the Roman Empire had never possessed a really homogeneous culture. After it spread out of Italy, the empire was an artificial union of alien social organisms which had been largely brought together by an amazing effort of military and administrative organization. But it was a shotgun marriage, not a love match. In the eastern part of the empire, Rome inherited the debris of Oriental and Hellenistic monarchies. In the west, Rome conquered and assimilated the tribal societies of European barbarians. Although there was a community of culture between cities, the Hellenistic cities of the east and the Latin cities of the west, this unity was superficial and it was mostly limited to a privileged class. It was a society of consumers based on slave labor and on the exploitation of subject classes and subject peoples. As soon as this privileged class was ruined by the economic crisis of the 3rd century and by the loss of its political privileges, the underlying differences between the eastern and western parts of the empire emerged as strong as ever. As it turned out, the West disintegrated totally and only the East survived with its firm base at Constantinople. And that was because the Eastern Empire was more compact and better able to defend itself, but also because the autocratic traditions of the East, even though they destroyed Rome's urban citizen class, were still better suited to running an empire than the decentralized, divisive tribalism of the West being revived by the incoming barbarians. Remember that long before Rome declined, the solution to the anarchy of the late Republic days had been found by appealing to Eastern ideas, one-man rule, God, kings, and all the rest. The Augustan restoration wouldn't have been possible without it. And when Constantine reorganized the Eastern Empire in the 4th century, he made it a sacred monarchy united by religion and based on a hierarchy of clergy and officials. In other words, he led a return to the underlying social and political tradition of the ancient East. In the provinces of the West, however, this tradition was absent. The Western peoples had more in common with the warrior tribalism of the North, with men like this, a Dacian from north of the Danube, than they did with the theocracy of the East. And so eventually the leadership of Western society fell into the hands of barbarian chieftains. Of the greatness that was Rome, only ruins and memories and myths were going to survive in the West.
All this took a long time to happen, of course. even before Rome passed on the torch to Constantinople, she lasted far more centuries than the United States have lasted so far. So perhaps the question shouldn't be, why did the empire come to an end, since all ancient empires explode or collapse when they get over a certain size and a certain age. Instead, we should probably ask, how come it lasted as long as it did? And there, your guess is as good as mine. Perhaps the long, desperate resistance of emperors and generals and ordinary people may have had something to do with the belief that the Roman Empire represented the last empire, and that as long as the Roman Empire lasted, the end of the world would not take place. They believed that the empire was the last age of humanity. When it fell, that would be the end of mankind and the last judgment would be upon us. So there was good reason to keep it from ending. There was good reason to pretend that it was alive even when it was dead, and then to revive it as soon as possible, as it would be revived when Charlemagne was crowned Roman Emperor in Rome on Christmas Day of the year 800. And although the Holy Roman Empire of Charlemagne and his successors was neither holy nor Roman nor really an empire, it was going to keep the myth going another 1,000 years. But that's another story for another time.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB